Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos, I am taking a look at Karl Popper's article Science, Conjectures and Refutations. And in this particular video, we will look at section 4, in which Popper introduces Hume's Problem of Induction, discusses both the problem and Hume's supposed psychological theory about induction, and starts to indicate where his own solution to the problem is going to differ from that of David Hume. Alright, so the problem of induction. Hume famously argues that whenever we try to move from what we have observed to what we haven't observed, for instance, moving from what we have observed to a prediction of the future, but it could also be a claim about something that we simply haven't observed because it's far away or in the past or we didn't look, that as soon as we try to move from what we know, what we've seen, what we've experienced, to something that goes beyond that experience, well, whatever we're going to be able to do, we're not going to be able to use deduction, right? We're not going to be able to use deductive reasoning, the kind of reasoning that proves something from premises in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Why not? Well, because all my experiences are these local things that don't really logically imply anything about what happens anywhere else in the universe. Right, and a famous example that that people give here would be, the sun rising. So I've seen the sun rise again and again and again and again in the morning. Does this in any way prove, in some kind of logically deductive sense of prove, that the sun will also rise like 24 hours from now? No, it doesn't prove that. It couldn't prove that because my experiences here are confined to one part of the universe and there is no logical relation, no logical implication from that, what I've seen here, to whatever I'm going to see in this future stage. So that is Hume's first claim, right? That deduction is never going to get us from what we've observed to what we haven't observed. And then Hume's second claim is that a supposed other way of reasoning, induction, which is supposed to sort of enlarge our knowledge by going beyond what we've seen to conclusions about what we haven't seen, that induction is in fact not a rational procedure. And Hume has several things to say about that. The way that Popper is going to frame it is, and this is sort of in line with Hume, the way that Popper is going to frame it is that supposed inductive arguments are invalid, right? If we check them out, if we compare them with what a deductive argument does, which guarantees the truth of its conclusion given the truth of its premises, induction doesn't do that. So if we use the term valid to mean deductively valid, then inductive arguments like, well, we've seen the sun rise so many times, it's going to rise again tomorrow, right? That's the conclusion that I draw from my past experiences. Well, that is not a valid conclusion. And so what Popper says is that he agrees with Hume. He says, Hume, I felt, was perfectly right in pointing out that induction cannot be logically justified. And then, at the end of this same paragraph, he says something like this. He says, in other words, an attempt to justify the practice of induction by an appeal to experience must lead to an infinite regress. As a result, we can say that theories can never be inferred from observation statements or rationally justified by them. Let me stress a couple of things. The first thing that I want to stress is that Hume's point and Popper's point is not that inductive conclusions are not certain. I mean, yes, they are not certain, but that is because they are not rationally justified at all. Hume's and Popper's point is much stronger than the simple fallibilist claim that inductive conclusions might be wrong. Hume and Popper argue that inductive conclusions are not rational, right? That the whole procedure of induction is not a rational procedure. That it's not only the case that we don't know for certain that the sun will rise tomorrow, it's also the case that we don't know that it's probable that the sun will rise tomorrow. And in fact, it is the case that we have no rational reason to believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. Right? There's no rational procedure that gets us from the experiences that we've had to any conclusion, whether in terms of certainty or in terms of probability, about what will happen in the future or the past or any other place really where we haven't done the observations yet. Okay, so that is important. This is not the simple claim that we might be wrong. This is a very strong claim about the impossibility of having rational beliefs about the future, the distant past, anything else that escapes our own experience. The second thing we want to notice is Popper's notion of a regress here. And so the thing that Popper is pointing at is that sometimes people say, well, I can justify induction. It works. It works really well. Right? I predicted every day for many, many days that the sun would rise, and every time it rose. So induction tends to work very well, and that's a good reason to believe that it will continue to work. And what Popper points out, not without justification, I would say, is that this is a procedure to justify induction that presupposes induction. Right? It presupposes that our past experiences of induction are a good guide and lead to rational conclusions about our future experiences with induction. And so we presuppose what we set out to prove. And so here Popper and Hume both conclude that induction is not justified. The only kind of justified reasoning is deduction. What should we think of that? Well, there are, I guess, many things to think of that and many attempts to solve the problem of induction. One way to, well, not really solve the problem of induction, but probably the thing that most thinkers actually do is to kind of ignore it, right? To say that, okay, we don't really know why induction works, but it seems to work, let's just use it. That is not very satisfactory, though, pragmatically, maybe that's something you'd have to settle for, but it's not very satisfactory, and I think that Hume and Popper are definitely right to push the envelope a little bit further. Well, here's another reaction, which is not so much a solution to the problem of induction, but an argument for why we don't need to solve it. And although Popper says nothing about it here, he does say something about it at the end of section 4 and in part 13 of the appendix to the article. Here's the sort of counter-argument. The counter-argument is, look, okay, Popper is right. It is a regress to try to justify induction through induction. But how else are we supposed to justify it? Right? Clearly, you cannot justify induction through deduction, because if we could justify induction through deduction, then induction would simply be deduction. So clearly we can't do that. So how bad is it that the best justification that we have for something is a regress? Well, let's think about our justification for deduction. If somebody asks us to justify deduction, then we can presumably give some kind of deductive argument for that. That's the best kind of argument that we have. Okay, but that presupposes that deduction works. So actually deduction is in the same boat as induction. Right? Induction might only be able to be justified inductively, but then again, deduction can only be justified through deduction. So we always sort of have to presuppose what it is that we want to end up with. Not sort of in general, but when it comes to these very basic ways of reasoning. And so this suggestion would go, induction is mysterious, maybe, but to claim that we need to find a non-circular justification is just to be mistaken about what kind of thing needs justification. Deduction doesn't need justification, or it maybe only needs circular justification. And the same holds true for induction. Popper is aware of this general strategy, and he doesn't want anything. He doesn't want any of it, right? He thinks that this is a disaster. And one reason he thinks it is a disaster is that he thinks that you can use this same way of reasoning to license absolutely everything, right? I mean, any kind of reasoning you can say, well, it fits itself, right? If my kind of reasoning is, well, something is true if it's in the Bible, and then I say, well, I don't really believe that. And you say, yeah, no, this is true. Here, check it out. The Bible itself says that everything in the Bible is true. I'm actually not sure whether the Bible does say that, but, assume that it does for purposes of this example. That doesn't look very good. And Popper, who is as always extremely interested in criticism and being critical, opening up this kind of move in philosophy would open the floodgates to irrationality. And so he doesn't want to go there. Of course, that leaves it open that there is something special about deduction and induction. Popper himself tells us that there is something special about deduction because it preserves truth value. If you put truths in, you get truths out. So that's good. And Popper seems to assume that there is no comparable story you can tell about induction. Okay, so that is Popper's point of departure here. He thinks that you can tell a plausible story about deduction, why it is special, that you can't tell a plausible story about induction, why it is special. And of course, other philosophers, including Kant, who we will meet in section 5, have tried to tell such a story, but we're not going to evaluate that here. This is Popper's starting point. This is what he agrees about with Hume. Induction is irrational. The only rational way of reasoning is deduction. Okay. That is a very strong claim. It is a claim that immediately and obviously leads to inductive skepticism, right? The idea that we cannot, in fact, know what happens in the future. Not just we can't know it for certain. I'm going to stress it again because it's so easy to be wrong about this, to misunderstand this. It's not just that we can't be certain about what will happen in the future. Almost everyone agrees with that. It is the claim that we can't have justified beliefs about what will happen in the future. Right? There is no rational way to arrive at any conclusion about what's going to happen in the future, no matter the strength of that conclusion. So again, it's not about certainty. It's not about certainty. It is not about certainty. Right? Popper is not making the common sense claim that everyone agrees with, that we can't know for certain what's going to happen in the future. He's making the much, much, much stronger claim that we can't have any rational belief about the future. Okay, so this is what Popper, at least not based on induction, and of course deduction can't give us many beliefs about the future, if any at all. So Popper tells us that he found Hume's refutation of inductive inference clear and conclusive, but that he felt dissatisfied with his psychological explanation of induction in terms of a custom or a habit. And so what Hume tells us is that, well, obviously we seem to use a lot of induction in daily life. How's that possible? What is going on? And he claims, well, it's not reasoning, because there's no reasoning possible to get us to an inductive conclusion. Rather, what is happening is that we human beings, after seeing something repeated a couple of times, fall into a certain kind of habit. So if every time, a little bit after my alarm clock goes off, the sun rises, I'm going to start expecting that. And that expectation generates a belief, right? As soon as I think about the following morning, I get a mental image of the sun rising. That is belief. And that is really the only thing that induction is. It's not really induction, it's just a habit. We sort of work in such a way that we start to expect the stuff that we have seen happen again and again and again and again and again and again. Now, Popper has a lot to say about this, and I would say that not all of it is perfectly clear, in part because Popper doesn't make a very clear distinction between patterns of observation and habits in the sense of repeated patterns of activity. Right? Hume is very clearly talking about patterns of observation, something passive, and Popper starts talking about how we learn to do something by rote, right? How we learn to do something like cycling by many repetitions. And he gets to talk about observation at some point, but his points about repetition in terms of patterns of activity, it's not 100% clear to me why he thinks that those are pertinent for judgment about Hume's theory of induction, Hume's psychological theory of induction. But, this is sort of only a lead up to something that Popper thinks is far more important. Because Popper thinks that if we think it through, we can see that Hume's story, that our expectations about the future are based purely on repetitions, can't really work. And here is why. The kind of repetition envisaged by Hume can never be perfect. The cases he has in mind cannot be cases of perfect sameness. They can only be cases of similarity. Thus, they are repetitions only from a certain point of view. But this means that for logical reasons, there must always be a point of view, such as a system of expectations, anticipations, assumptions, or interests, before there can be any repetition, which point of view, consequently, cannot be merely the result of repetition. So, what I think that Popper is criticizing here is not so much Hume's theory of induction as the result of inductive beliefs, well, not really inductive beliefs, but beliefs about the future as based on repetition. What Popper is criticizing is the idea that, well, really the empiricist idea, which Hume certainly embraces, that we start out as a blank slate, right? That we start from nothing, and then the repetitions start, and then we get into these habits. And Popper says, well, that's impossible, because, well, first of all, there's no real repetition, right? One thing happens and something else happens, and whether those two things fall in the same category, whether I recognize both of them as the sun going up, it's not the exact same experience, that depends on me, right? On the way that I think, on maybe what Popper tells us, what I expect or anticipate or assume, or what interests me. So maybe what interests me is that I want to be able to see things. And so what I, experience again and again is this going from an inability to see things because it's dark to an ability to see things because it's light. Right? That interests me. And that's why I experience these situations as the same or the same kind of experience. And that is when, I start recognizing things as repetitions and when I can form habits. And, from a logical point of view, I think Popper would certainly seem to be right. The empiricist idea of a tabula rasa, of a blank slate, is really hard to hold on to. And one of the reasons is the reason that Popper gives us here, right? That any kind of sort of learning from experience would seem to require concepts. And so we can never be in a state where our concepts first have to be generated by experience. I think that's right. And that, I think, is roughly the story that Popper is telling us. So it doesn't seem to do that much, actually, against Hume's theory that we arrive, like in daily life, at our supposedly inductive beliefs through these kinds of repetitions. Right? It's only about this sort of first stage. So all that Hume has to do is he has to add the idea that, when we are born, we already have some beliefs or some concepts or some expectations or something like that. And then his story can get started. But Popper takes it to be a bit broader. Right? Popper thinks that this sort of shows that Hume's model is wrong and that Hume should have chosen an entirely different tack. He should have tried a very completely different strategy. And Popper sets out for us the two strategies in a kind of helpful way. He says, look, there are two possible answers. One, we obtain our knowledge by a non-inductive procedure. This answer would have allowed Hume to retain a form of rationalism. Two, We obtain our knowledge by repetition and induction, and therefore by a logically invalid and rationally unjustifiable procedure, so that all apparent knowledge is merely a kind of belief based on habit. So Popper says, well, Hume chose two. He chose to take induction, he showed that it was irrational, but then he said, we nevertheless do it. And he sees this as Hume capitulating to common sense. He struck a bargain with common sense, meekly allowing the re-entry of induction by repetition. I don't think there's anything meek about Hume's treatise, to be honest. Hume tells us that he is, I think he does this in the Inquiry very explicitly, he tells us that, okay, his philosophy implies inductive skepticism, and that's great because he wants to be a skeptic, because skepticism is the road to the good life. Not too meek, I would say. But okay, this is what I guess Popper thinks it's meek because he wants to do the other strategy, and he thinks that's the really hard-nosed scientific way of doing things. So the other strategy is to say that we obtain our knowledge by a non-inductive procedure. Well, what other procedures are there? Well, strictly speaking, when it comes to knowledge, having just gotten rid of induction, the one thing that Popper ought to say is that we can only receive our knowledge through deduction, right? That's the only road that is open to us. And we also know, from logical reasons, that deduction cannot give us knowledge about the future, right? Because whatever happens in the future does not follow deductively from what happened in the past and what we have experienced. So what kind of knowledge is Popper talking about when he says that we obtain our knowledge by a non-inductive procedure? Well, of course, there is the knowledge that we get from deduction, which everyone agrees about, but that would seem to be it, right? And when it comes to a claim like the sun will rise tomorrow, well, we don't know that, right? If induction is irrational, if it doesn't work, then we do not know that the sun will rise tomorrow. So I think there's something a little bit misleading about the way that Popper sets this up, and I think that this is going to be very important for our interpretation of the rest of the article, because Popper introduces a sort of ambiguity in the term knowledge, which allows him to say, on the one hand, that, he denies induction, and there's no such thing as inductive knowledge. And on the other hand, to sort of keep talking about knowledge in ways that fit our common way of using that term very well, and ways that kind of hide the extremeness of his own inductive skepticism. Okay, I'm going to show that, for instance, with a passage in paragraph 5, but also, I guess, already a little bit with what is happening here at the end of section 4. Let me read the end of section 4. Thus, I was led, by purely logical considerations, to replace the psychological theory of induction by the following view. Without waiting passively for repetitions to impress or impose regularities upon us, we actively try to impose regularities upon the world. We try to discover similarities in it and to interpret it in terms of laws invented by us. Without waiting for premises, we jump to conclusions. These may have to be discarded later, should observations show that they are wrong. This was a theory of trial and error, of conjectures and refutations. Conjectures and refutations. Well, here is Popper's basic story about how science works. I come up with a theory, preferably some bold hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is not something I believe in. It's not something I have rational arguments for. As Popper says here, without waiting for premises, we jump to conclusions. But of course, this is not a real conclusion. We actually shouldn't use the word conclusion for this, because that suggests that we are in the realm of rationality. But we're not in the realm of rationality, we're in the realm of pure invention. I just come up with a hypothesis. I can do whatever I want, as long as it's testable, and I'm doing better if it's more testable, more bold, more risky, right? We know all this from sections 1 and 2. So I do that, and then I search out refutations, right? I search in the world for things that would show that my bold hypothesis, my weird idea maybe, is wrong. And when it's wrong, I can deductively, at least that is Popper's story, I can deductively conclude that it is wrong. Because the theory implies this observation, the observation doesn't happen, so the theory must be wrong. No induction there, that's just deduction. If the theory implies the observation, if the observation doesn't happen, then the theory must be wrong. All of that is supposed to be purely deductive. So that is Popper's basic story. And again, I think we should be very careful. Because at no point before the refutation is there any knowledge. Right? Knowledge only comes in. And in fact, reasoning only comes in, you could say, at the moment that the refutation happens. Because then I can rationally conclude that the theory is false. And then I know that the theory is false. And before that, I know nothing. Right? There's no point at which I know that the theory is true. There's no point at which I know that the theory is likely. There is no point at which the theory is the rational conclusion of some kind of argument. And so the term conclusion that Popper uses here, I think he should not have used it. Okay, so this is trial and error, conjectures and refutations. It made it possible to understand why our attempts to force interpretations upon the world were logically prior to the observation of similarities. Since there were logical reasons behind this procedure, I thought that it would apply in the field of science also, that scientific theories were not the digest of observations, but that they were inventions, conjectures boldly put forward for trial, to be eliminated if they clashed with observations which were rarely accidental, but as a rule undertaken with the definite intention of testing a theory by obtaining, if possible, a decisive refutation. We need once again to be very careful here with this phrase trial and error, because trial and error can describe two different things. Trial and error can describe, and that's really what the term means, I would say, the kind of procedure that Popper is outlining here, where I just come up with something, try it out, and if it doesn't work, I throw it away, and that's it. Right? That's the only thing I do. Well, that's one way to understand trial and error. Here's another way to understand trial and error. It is to think of it as, we have some theories, and we have certain confidence in those theories, but if they turn out to be wrong, like if we test them and they turn out to be wrong, then we reject them, we throw them away, and we use this new evidence to, think of which theory is now the most likely. That would be an inductive procedure, right? Because that would be a procedure, the way I described it, a procedure where we believe things, where we think it is rational to believe one theory or another, maybe believe one theory until we are shown to be wrong, until error shows up, and then we transfer our belief to something else. That is the kind of story that Popper rejects, right? So that is not what he means. So again, Popper is not saying that we are fallible and we should be on the lookout for signs of error so we can reject our theories if they turn out to be wrong. No, Popper is saying that trial and error, having mere wild conjectures and then searching for refutations, that is the method of science, and in fact, that is the thing that comes in place of what traditionally was thought to be inductive knowledge. And this is a really wild claim. And to see how wild it is, just think about something like engineering. Right? It is presumably impossible to believe that building a gigantic bridge is trial and error in the strong sense that we just mentioned. Right? Nobody is going to build a bridge because it's a bold conjecture and let's see whether it falls down or not. No. When we build a bridge, we want to base ourselves on theories and models that we are really confident about. But that's impossible if we are inductive skeptics a la Hume and Popper. And nothing that Popper has said so far, and in fact nothing that he is going to say, is going to remove the irrationality of believing that any theory or model that you're going to use in your engineering task will make correct predictions about the future. Because inductive reasoning is irrational. You can't get to the future. Okay, so whatever we think about the Conjectures and Refutations procedure in theoretical science, it would seem to be a terrible fit for what we actually do in practical situations like engineering. And this is a point made later on by people like Wesley Selman and Hilary Putnam and probably others as sort of a main core criticism of Popper's theory of falsificationism. All right, but so far we are only at section 4 and there's still a lot of article to go, so I hope you will join me again when we look at section 5.